Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hi. Good. How are you?
Very good as well. Good. So we're going to be doing product sense today then. In that case, I'll spend most of the time asking questions, but I'll keep some time at the end for feedback. And as always, if you faced a question before, let me know and I'll change it to something else. All right?
That sounds
Good. All right. You're Netflix's chief product officer. How do you put together a strategy for the next 10 years?
got it. So first of all, I haven't dealt with this question or this type of question, so it'll be a good one to practice on. So I think I'll start with a couple of clarifying questions. So thinking of Netflix's strategy for the next 10 years, is there any specific space we want to target? Like, are we thinking more around the partnership side? Are we thinking more around bolstering the existing capability? Are there any specific goals that we should have in mind, or is this pretty open-ended?
This is open-ended. Everything is, I'd say, a valid candidates for our roadmap. I'd like you to tell me what a good focus area could be, and then we'll deep dive into that a little bit more.
Okay, got it. And then the other question is, we're really assuming that Netflix obviously is a fairly mature ecosystem. And in the next 10 years, my general assumption is that we're going to continue focusing on growth and engagement. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, that's the goal of the company as a whole. Let's say we've got one primary product, which is Netflix's streaming service at the moment. If you think it's worth investing in an alternative product or doubling down on this product, both are valid grounds for this interview, but I'd like you to make that judgment call.
Okay, makes sense. So this is an interesting one where we're not necessarily thinking about it from a design perspective. It's more on the strategy front. So I want to take about 30 seconds just to gather my thoughts on how best to manage through this, and I can then state the structure of how I want to look at this. Is that okay?
All right. Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So here's how I want to tackle this. So at a very broad level, we're thinking of a really mature product. It is pretty ubiquitous. It's in at least 100 countries. I don't know the exact count, but over 100 countries. And we have really solved for growth and engagement to a large extent. And it's a fairly well monetized product as well. I would consider Netflix as one of the market leaders in this space. So really our play is from a market consolidation perspective. So very high level goals I would think of as, one is further growth and engagement, where we want to make sure that we're going into more areas that we haven't previously. The other is really looking at gaining more market share, because in a lot of these areas, although Netflix is pretty ubiquitous, we still compete with Hulu and several other services and a lot of niche providers in a lot of areas where Netflix may be a second choice. So I would, as a CPO, I would think of how do we really build products that really solve for those use cases, right? And then really how I want to, break down this fairly broad goal that we have for the next 10 years is I want to think about the North Star metrics that we want to drive for, but I also want to think about breaking the product area into a few broad sub segments, if you will, right? And I want to think about how do we really optimize for each of these user journey segments, if you will, and how do we really build products that can really tie back to the core goals. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure. Sounds good.
Okay. So the first thing I want to do here then is really break down Netflix into different product areas. And I want to think about, if we're talking about improving across the board, I want to see how best we can break down the product into several product areas, from, say, the initial acquisition of content all the way to delivering a good quality of service. And there's a lot that happens in between. So I want to break that down. Then I want to look at, key metrics that we can associate and how best we can potentially look at building capabilities that improve on all those areas. Does that sound good?
Yep. All right. Let's talk about the journey.
So,
yeah.
Cool. So if you don't mind, I'd like to take about 30 more seconds just to kind of organize around that journey. And since we're sort of doing this remotely, I want to think about it out loud, but I still want to make sure I'm reasonably exhaustive in the process.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you. So let me kind of state how I've broken this down, and I definitely want to pivot in areas where we think this may not be taking us on the right direction. But since I'm doing this on the fly, I really thought about this from a user journey perspective, where for a user to be able to see certain content, how do we really think about everything that happens behind the scenes till they get there, right? So,
All right.
and I would term it as more of the product journey as opposed to the user journey as a correction. So, the very first piece is content acquisition and growth, where it's important to keep renewing titles or keep bringing new content, because one of the strengths of Netflix is really in how exhaustive the collection really is, and it caters to a very vast swath of users. So the acquisition side of things is super important. The second area is really around viewer experience, as I would call it, really where once a user is active as a Netflix customer, what really keeps them there, and how good is that experience, both from a viewing perspective as well as things like engagement with Netflix Party and several other things. So I think that's important. The third area that I broke it down into is what I call the catalog of content that exists. And it's a little different from the first category, which is more around acquiring new content. But the catalog really refers to everything that's in there. So I would break it down into things like artists, publications, and really looking at the pipeline of things that are there and really optimizing that space. The fourth area I can think of is more of what I call the ecosystem. And what I mean by this is looking at a combination of third-party content that gets onto Netflix, as well as really content creation. So building that ecosystem for production, if you will. And this, I suspect, is one of the areas where we're investing a lot, but I want to continually look at optimizing for it. The fifth area is API integrations. And this is where this might be a little out there, but I'm thinking of how do we really bake Netflix into, say, a third-party ecosystem. So I'm thinking of areas like how could we monetize for something like, say, Uber partnering with Netflix and providing an in-ride viewing experience powered by Netflix and that sort of thing. And then the last area directly ties to quality of service, but I would break it down into quality of service and reporting, where I think it's pretty central to the product in looking at how do we really best optimize for the overall experience, and how do we kind of gain visibility into what's important to the user, issues users are having, how do we proactively solve for it, and that sort of thing. So to summarize, it's the acquisition and growth, the viewer experience, the content catalog, the ecosystem, API integrations, and quality of service. Those are the 6 areas that I broke this down into.
All right. So that's good. That's quite a wide variety of topics we could choose to focus on. Which do you think will be core to driving Netflix's strategy?
Yeah, so I think this is an important distinction, and I think all of these areas are important, but thinking really longer term, the two things that I think are most important, since 10 years is sort of the marker here, I feel a lot of these things are imperative, but I would prioritize for, say, the catalog, which really on a sustained basis needs to be high quality and highly relevant to the user, as well as sort of the ecosystem of it, meaning it's in our best interest from a competitive perspective to continually look at producing content and building things that users would most like, or creating content that would resonate mostly with users. So I think those are the 2 areas that I would want to optimize for.
All right. And how does this tie into your original identification of goals around further growth and engagement versus growing more market share?
Yeah, let me think about that a little bit. So, and I'll think about this out loud. So the original goals that I thought make sense from Netflix's perspective are, from a longer term perspective, one was continuing to grow, pushing more and more into newer areas, gaining more market share. So for instance, in a very specific market, like let's say India as an example, there's tons of platforms. There's Hotstar, there's 𝗥𝗲𝘀cie𝘂𝗿𝗰𝗲𝘀, there's a lot of these which create very nuanced content that have that validation from the local market in terms of what really is popular and so on. So producing content that's very specific to that market would be key in kind of gaining that additional market share. That's one. The other is, when I thought about the catalog, that I'm really referring to the repository of content, which really breaks down into artists, publications, and so on, where I think it's really important to really cater to a specific market. So if you're looking to gain market share in a certain area, it's important to create tools and optimize the experience for a local production house, let's say. So I think that's kind of where I feel these two kind of tie back to the core goals, where growing users is definitely a key goal, but gaining market share requires us to look even beyond users and really looking at content creation both self-driven as well as partnering through a third party. Does that make sense?
Right. Yep, it does. Let's switch tacks a little bit. We've identified two good product ecosystems you could choose to concentrate on. Pick whichever you think is most relevant for your longer term strategy. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you choose to build that out and make it better for Netflix.
Got it. Let me think about that a little bit. So there's two things we had. One was really producing content that is very relevant in a certain space, and the other is really the catalog. I think producing content, to be honest, would be an area where I think it's very nuanced, requires a lot of very specific input. I would be inclined more towards thinking about the catalog, because this is where I think, irrespective of what the market is, there may be very common signals on what we should build for, who the user personas we should prioritize for really are, what their pain points are, and so on. So I would like to prioritize for that. Is that okay?
All right, we'll go with the catalog.
Okay. So how I want to go through this is really think of catalog as a specific feature or a specific product. And I'm assuming that this is a product that is already really mature, but I really want to think about what are things that can really set it up for success in the longer term. So from that perspective, the metrics that guide my product design here would be things like, what are things that we can do to continually keep user engagement high? What are things that can really help keep user attention, as well as what are things that can really help kind of drive market share from a growth perspective? And as part of optimizing for this in the longer term, I really want to think about what are areas, what are really the user personas that we need to optimize for, what are their needs and pain points, and what are solutions that we can potentially build there. So from that perspective, I want to start thinking about the user and their journey a little bit. Is it okay if I take about 30 seconds or so just to kind of break this problem space a little bit down?
Yes, of course.
Okay, let me break down this exercise a little bit. So we're trying to do three things here. So one is really identifying a persona that we want to optimize for. Yep. Then we want to look at what the needs and pain points are. And then I want to look at solutions, right? So I think let me do the first part first. And then I want to make sure that we are narrowing down and prioritizing on one before we kind of move forward, right? So the personas, right? So I think looking at optimizing and evolving Netflix's catalog really involves three different personas that I can think of. So one is really power users, and these are people who binge a lot, may consume a very wide aspect of the catalog. And what I'm thinking about is these are people that may view a lot of different content and can go deep, meaning they tend to finish a lot of content, and their view time for a single title may be a lot. So there's the depth and the breadth aspect of it. The second category is users who are medium engaged, I would call them. And I'm thinking of people who may be subscribed to 3 or 4 or more subscription services, and Netflix is one of them. And we are probably less than 20%. We probably have less than 20% of their mind share. So how do we really optimize for that? That's the other persona I can think of. The third one I can think of is something I would read as a small to medium-sized artist. And what I mean by this here is Netflix caters to people of different swaths. It can be, say, a stand-up comic that just made it somewhat big, so they got a Netflix special, all the way to a big movie production house like, say, a DC or a Marvel that kind of gets a movie on Netflix. I want to optimize for the bottom end of the spectrum, because that's where I think a lot of that uniqueness and ubiquity can come. Thinking of somebody like a budding artist, where how do we really potentially build tools that can optimize for new content that may have very less visibility, but how do we potentially use Netflix as a platform to optimize for that? That one really appeals to me, because I think there's a lot of that long tail reach that we can build through that. Does that sound good?
Yep. Which of these would you want to focus on?
So that's what I was wrapping to. So thinking of power users who are less than 20% engaged, and the budding artists, I would prioritize for the third category, because that's where I think optimizing the catalog would bring a vaster reach or a lot of breadth to the catalog. So I want to optimize for that.
Got it.
Okay. Let me kind of state the structure of how I want to go through the rest of the process here, right? So I want to start with what kind of pain points make sense to solve for, what are the needs that are high impact, and then I want to think of solutions that make sense here.
But I would like to delve a little bit deeper into the pain points and solutions part, and then we'll map it back to the overall strategy, and I'll ask you to summarize from that perspective.
Okay, that sounds good. So let me take about 30 seconds just to kind of map this out very quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. So one thing I want to caveat here is the direction that I'm kind of going through with is a bit of a departure from the traditional Netflix problem space, if you will, but that is where I think I don't mind doing that because it's more of a longer term view and it's a 10-year horizon that we're looking at, right? So thinking of a budding artist or creator, right? Someone that's relatively small time, but potentially wants to really make their content more visible or really create unique content. So how do we really make it easier for them is kind of how I'm thinking about the pain points and needs with. So there's 4 pain points that I thought of. One is it is hard to piece all the required parts together for a small time creator. So as an example, I may have a really good script, I may have actors, but I may need a sound guy or I may need an editor. That's a pain point. The other is kind of getting guidance and mentorship, where I may have, really good workflow. I may have several things in the mix, but how do we really get more guidance from someone who's more experienced in this space? So that's a pain point. The other is really getting in front of the right audience, where how do I make sure that my content is discovered? How do I make sure that my content gets in front of people that it resonates the most with? How do I really target the right viewership? And then the last one is, I call this sort of the lack of creation tools, where I may be pretty limited with tools that may be pretty daunting to kind of build with. And if I'm somebody that doesn't have a ton of editing experience and I still want to do it, how do I really optimize for it? So that would be sort of a need that I can think of. And essentially the theme of what I'm kind of working with here is I'm somebody that is very early on in that life cycle. How do I really utilize a platform? How does Netflix as a platform really optimize for these and make it easier for people to create content in a more social way, right? So I want to think of solutions from that perspective. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, in fact, like, to make this a little bit simple, I'd like to concentrate on the first of these ideas. The fact that a lot of people have great pieces that are ready, but not the last missing piece. It might be the sound guy, the editing guy, or whatever. How do you think Netflix could help artists like this?
Okay, makes sense. So just to reiterate the pain point or the need, we're thinking of a small-time creator or artist who might be in need for different parts of their ecosystem, right? So to really create content, how do they do it in a more seamless manner? Let me take a few more seconds. Just want to map out potential solutions here. Okay, so this obviously needs to be fleshed out a lot more, but I think at a high level, the solution that can directly address something like this is that Netflix is a platform that has creators of all forms that kind of interact with it. It has viewers of all forms and people across the spectrum. So one of the things that I feel Netflix can really move the needle for budding artists and creators is through something like a creator marketplace, right? And I'm thinking of something on the lines of a two-sided marketplace where the one is, as a creator, I can post a need to either have someone do a gig for me or potentially partner with me or somebody that I would want to hire. On the seller side of that ecosystem, as an artist, I can make myself available to either collaborate with other artists, potentially go help with a small project, or potentially sign up as a longer term commitment with somebody. So I think the benefit that I can think that Netflix can offer here is that through a marketplace, there's a lot of contextual information that can be made available through the viewership detail that's there. And instead of just doing this out there, I can think of ways in which Netflix can ensure a certain baseline of quality and ensure that if I'm a small-time artist, I can really get my work validated, as well as ensure that I'm connected with folks that can really help move the needle for me significantly. Let me just pause there. I can certainly think of fleshing this out, but that's the high level of what I'm thinking of from a solution perspective.
All right, so just let us flesh it out a little bit better. So what would the product look like for you in this context?
Yeah, I'll think about this out loud. So at a high level, there's two aspects to it. So I think the problem space and the solution is very clear, where it's a marketplace. The thing that can make it very effective is really the social aspect of it. So this is kind of where I think it's a little out there from Netflix's perspective, where I'm thinking of Netflix really evolving into a social platform for creators and viewers, where there's two models I can think of. So one is something that can leverage say something like a Facebook, where there's a profile that people can import into Netflix. And there's suddenly this social aspect that kind of comes into the picture, where there's a lot of that contextual information on what interests really are, things that people really care about, and there's a lot of value that can come out of it. So as a creator, I'm thinking of something like a two-sided marketplace where I can either say, hey, I'm an artist that is really good with scripts, and here's sort of validation of everybody that follows me. Here's my popularity index, things of that nature. I can post a requirement based on all of that. Somebody that's on the other side, that's an editor, can have something very similar that can be matched, saying, here's the quality of work that I've done. Here's testimonials. Here's a timeline of everything that I have done. Here's an example of my work. And really the matching, I can think of it as really something that Netflix can drive as a platform, saying, instead of me just kind of getting a recommendation of 1,000 different editors, I can get very hyper-targeted recommendations saying, for everything that we know about you in this social context, here's somebody that can really be a good fit for you. So narrowing that down to, say, less than 10 number of choices that the poster can really have is kind of what I'm thinking about.
How would this be different, for instance, from Fiverr or Freelancer?
Yeah, so there's a couple of aspects that I can think of. So one is really, if I'm leveraging a platform like Facebook to really integrate into this, the social graph would be the differentiator. So one is the reputation score associated with somebody's profile, and the other is really the contextual information that's available. So the gap in Fiverr really is that you're still trying to connect with a stranger, and that's okay in certain contexts, but with somebody like Facebook bringing in, say, 2,000 plus data points about each profile, I think there's a ton of contextual information that me, as someone that's looking to partner with a fellow artist, can really leverage. I think that's super helpful. The other is, this is where I'm thinking about Netflix overall kind of looking at quality as an index and saying that I'm only allowing, say, artists that match a certain bar. So I'm thinking of something like a certification process through which Netflix can really say that at the end of the day, I care about the quality of content that's created on the platform. So I need to ensure that the artists have done X, Y, and Z. So I can set that as a baseline. So that is, again, very different from what a third-party platform might do in this space. So those are sort of the two broad capabilities. So one is the quality index that Netflix can ensure, and the other is the social graph that Netflix can potentially partner with Facebook to.
All right, got it. Let's put you back in the chief product officer role. You have to pitch your overall strategy to your CEO, and you have to spend like a couple of sentences talking about this particular topic of a catalog and the marketplace you proposed within that. Take a minute or so, think of how you'd frame this, and maybe deliver that pitch in a few sentences right now.
Okay, sounds good. So let me just take a minute to do that real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing I'll call out here is I am not 100% familiar with what Netflix's mission really is. If I were, I would have woven that into this here, but I think that would be pretty important for a conversation with a CEO. But I have a vague assumption on what that really is, so I'll work with that. But effectively, my pitch really would be that we have an opportunity to evolve Netflix into a creator marketplace, which does three things. The one is it creates very unique content that is very nuanced, very targeted to the markets that we might be looking to enter into. It enables crowdsourced content creation. So we're not just either linking content that's already out there or producing content. We are really enabling our audience to create content. And we're also driving engagement through hyper-targeted recommendations, where we might have the ability to know exactly what appeals to our users. We already have that information. We can create content that specifically appeals to them. So the creator marketplace really enables us an opportunity to go into the next decade with, in addition to everything that we already have in our catalog, with a very socially driven, crowdsourced viewing experience.
Got it. Cool.
Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe. Our website is Prepfully.com. We've got lots of interview questions there. You can also schedule a mock interview with one of our experts. You can find the link in the description below. All the best from us at Prepfully, and we hope you totally rock your interview.